And okay, great. Well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. Thanks for joining us for another virtual event. And tonight we have with us Brian Klingborg, going to be discussing his brand new book, The Magistrate. And Brian has signed a batch of books for us. Here's that. And so I will go ahead and put a link to that in the comments field. And if you have questions for Brian, just go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will summon me back on screen towards the end of the hour, and I'd be happy to ask any questions you might have. So Barbara, over to you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Yeah, I think this is quite an arresting cover, Brian. What do you think?
There's a funny story behind that cover. So of course the book deals with corruption in China, and the background artwork was there. But they originally sent the cover with a picture of a guy who looked more like Al Capone. He had a fedora and a suit on. And I said to my editor, you know, Chinese gangsters don't look dressed like the 1930s Chicago. So I actually sent them a picture of an actor named Chow Yun-fat, who made a famous movie in the 90s called A Better Tomorrow. And it's a picture of him lighting a cigar with $100 counterfeit bills. And about 5 minutes later, they sent me back that, which is just perfect. So yeah, I thought that was pretty funny.
Well, yeah, he is an arresting character, and I like the color. You know,
the color's great.
Quite an arresting acid green. See if I can say that. And then there's some sort of Chinesey mountains there. Do you know, when I went to China and we were sailing down the Yangtze River, and it wasn't too long after I'd been to Scotland, and I was amazed at how similar the geology was. You know, the landscape, the hills and so forth. There's more water in China than there was in Scotland. Well, actually, that's not true. Scotland up in the highlands is extremely wet. So
yeah.
But you know, these volcanic-based landscapes are similar all over the world. Japan, very similar too. Many, you know, so I think
China's such a big place that you've got a desert, you've got a swamp, you've got mountains. It's kind of like California. You know, California's got a little bit of every landscape as well.
There's a Nat Geo feature, and I can't remember the narrator, but basically it's exploring the Great Wall of China and looking into more of it than anybody had thought about, you know, pushing out in, because it's largely just a mud, you know, thing by now. But, you know, using drones has allowed some phenomenal photography for a countryside like China, which is so vast and so varied, although actually they're using it like crazy in, you know, European settings and everything else. I think drones are responsible for much of the positive response to streaming television, because you know, it's like a travel log, you know, with a story. But speaking of, I had to actually look up Harbin when I read your first book, because I had no real clear memory of where Harbin is. So in Thief of Souls, right?
Yeah.
So why don't, and I just cut you off from saying something, so I apologize. Why don't you say that? And then why don't you tell us where Harbin is and about the province and all the rest of it?
Sure. What I was saying is that drones and video, YouTube video has become an important research, access for writers, because you can actually look up cities and look up landscapes and see what they look like, or you can Google, certain Chinese restaurants or things like that. So you can get more of a real view of these places as opposed to just imagining them. I always like to use as much factual information as I can when I'm creating settings or landscapes. As far as Harbin goes, it's a city, it's the capital of Heilongjiang province in the far north of China, the most northern most province of China, sort of along the Russian border on the eastern side. So it's a large province, very cold, lots of tundra, that sort of thing, kind of a forbidding landscape.
Indeed it is, and there's a river that runs through it. I did a fascinating Zoom year before last for a book called The Owls of Eastern Siberia, which was a personal thing for me because I really like owls. And also I still remember just a little Russian. And anyway, to do that, there was a long sort of journey along that border. And then there's a travel book that somebody who's the famous travel writer that just wrote possibly his last book because he's in his late 80s or something. But he too wanted to travel along that border, largely a riverine border between China and Russia. And I've also read that, for centuries, the capital of China was more like in the middle of China, and Beijing is kind of an odd place for it. No odder, I might say, than Washington, D.C., which is, over on the eastern seaboard there and not central. But the original capital, Xi'an and so forth, was much more central to China. Who was it was it the Manchu dynasty or the, must have been not the Ming, but the Manchu that decided that Beijing would be the capital? Was it?
No, boy, I can't remember exactly. The Manchus came in the 1600s. The Mings were before that. So the Ming dynasty also had their capital in Beijing.
Must have been, I have them backwards. I forgot. Okay, so the Ming was first?
Yeah. No, the Ming was first and then the Qing. Yep.
But they had ties to the north and to, so I think that might be why Beijing was more comfortable for them. By the way, this is Brian's publication day, so I'm going to glance it up. It's not Chinese wine, it's French, but nonetheless, a little toast to the Magistrate, which is the third in this really excellent series. There you go. That began with Thief of Souls and then took a very interesting kind of a detour down towards Vietnam, if I remember right, in Wild Prey.
Went into Burma. Yeah, Myanmar.
It was Burma. It was Myanmar, right? Yeah. Exactly. But so had to do with the wild animal
trafficking. Yep.
Yeah, which is a major thing because Chinese medicine has not ever given up exactly on, bears, rhinoceri, tigers.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it ever will, but I've actually spent time in South Africa where the traffic to China and rhino horns and so forth, it just breaks your heart. And we have a similar problem with bears here in the, bear gall and whatever it is that also is a big export to China. So one hopes that they'll get away from traditional medicine one day, but not anytime soon. Anyway, we're in Harbin. So why did you decide to pick a place so remote?
Because I wanted to do something different than what most other writers would do if they were writing a book about China, which would be Shanghai or Beijing. And I wanted to have a character that had a past of some kind. And so Lu Fei, the protagonist of these books, was a police officer, a rising star in the police department in Harbin, who then got exiled to a smaller town called Raven Valley Township. So I wanted to construct it in such a way that he was kind of in the boondocks. If you're reading books about China, mysteries or thrillers or whatever, generally people gravitate towards the big cities. And I really wanted to explore small town life because it made it easier to bring out different aspects of Chinese culture and society, but also I just wanted to talk about things that normal people are facing in China instead of your rich and famous types. That's why.
Well, you've had some remarkable reviews for this book. You had a starred review in Publishers Weekly, you had a great review in the Wall Street Journal. And one, I don't remember which one, but one in particular talked about that you're able to kind of portray for readers what life is like under Xi in China, how repressive. The Chinese, like the Russians, have this long history of autocracy and almost no acquaintance with any sort of republic or democratic or whatever it is. And they seem to fall right back into it. Just like the French did after the French Revolution, yay for democracy and all, and then bang, they had Napoleon. Yeah, and so it's interesting how many revolutions really just evolved back to, the Russian Revolution ended with Stalin, whatever went on in China ended with Mao. And now they have Xi, and you wonder whether it's ever possible to take a society with, centuries of autocracy and change them.
Yeah, I'm not a historian. Of course, I've studied Chinese history, but China's an interesting case. They did have a so-called republic when they overthrew the emperor. The problem was that you had immediately all the different provinces being divided up among warlords.
Right.
And Chiang Kai-shek, who was the military leader of the republic at that time, went after the warlords to try to unite the country, but at the same time, you had the Communist Party since the 1920s under Mao and various other people agitating. So you had, in the countryside, these different factions fighting for control. It was very difficult to unite the country. The technology was such, the number of military, the size of the army that Chiang Kai-shek had, the poverty involved, all those sorts of things really conspired against him uniting it and led to the countryside sort of pivoting towards Mao. So then you had the revolution, of course, in 1949, Communist Revolution. Mao took over, and things did not go that well. And so in some ways, the experiment was worthwhile, but in many ways it wasn't. And when he died, Deng Xiaoping took over, and Deng Xiaoping was much more of a pragmatist and understood that you had to get the economy flowing. And that was really what he was about. That was his famous dictum, it doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice. He wanted to lift people out of poverty. He wanted to improve the conditions in the country. And their economic experiment was quite successful. However, the Chinese people haven't traditionally been experienced with what we call a democracy. So they've traded economic stability and social, stability for political power. And now that's come around again and allowed Xi to sort of co-opt the government.
Very true. Although I've always thought there was a strongly capitalistic streak in the Chinese. I mean, they famously in trade and merchants and, very inventive. I mean, think of all the stuff that we owe to China, like paper, for example, and fireworks. And, it's a really it's older than the Egyptian civilization. It goes back, to 5,000 or 6,000 BC. So, I've always thought that was an interesting counter strain, is that, right at the moment, you've got this monolithic and repressive party. And yet, you've got, as I said, this kind of, basic capitalistic, inventive merchant streak. And I'm finding it hard to imagine how this is going to play out.
Right. And I nobody knows. And, that, as I mentioned, the thing is that the average person on the street saw that, starting from the late 70s, the fortunes of their relatives and themselves and their children were improving. They were able to get better quality housing, better quality healthcare. They were able to start businesses. They were able to travel abroad for vacation or to buy things. There were more foreign goods, and they were happy with that. They were willing to trade the ability to elect their local representatives in return for that kind of economic and political stability. And, the political system in China, again, I'm not an expert, but the political system in China up until Xi sort of co-opted everything was, a bit of a trade-off. You had different factions that were trading power, that were ruling by consensus. No one person was in charge. But over the past 5 or 6 years, as Xi has really consolidated his power, he started to make a lot of decisions. COVID, for example, his zero COVID policy, just recently abandoned 6 months or so ago. Before that, if anybody tested positive in your apartment building for COVID, they shut the entire apartment building down. There's all these dystopian videos of drones flying over Chinese cities. If they see somebody out on the streets, the mechanical voice telling them to go home, and this kind of thing. So a lot of Xi's repressive policies are starting to have a negative effect on the economy. So now we have to wait and see. The Chinese citizens have been willing to accept a certain amount or a lack of political agency in return for economic benefits. But as the economic situation worsens, let's see what happens. It'll be very interesting to watch.
No, I think it will be. And, I'm a big fan. Much of what I knew about China up until recently, I culled from the works of Robert Van Gulik, because I was absolutely crazy about the Tang Dynasty, Judge Dee. And, it was not a monogamous society. I mean, there were multiple wives, there were official concubines, families were, quite large. In fact, the last empress of China was originally the concubine of the emperor. So it was very much like, the Ottoman Empire, and that, you can imagine that the same stuff went on in the palaces in Istanbul as went on in the palaces in Beijing. So the family structure suddenly changed, and, the one child policy has come back to haunt them. So there's been social engineering as well as economic engineering and, political change. There's been an awful lot for a country to absorb.
Yeah.
But what I like about this long way around of saying that I do think that what Brian's done so well is to go down to sort of the everyday small person's life in a small town. I guess you can't really call it a village. It's probably a little more sophisticated than a village, not agrarian anyway, in that respect, which is sort of like suburban Harbin.
Yeah, in China, they have different rankings of towns. This one would be a township. A township can be quite sizable, could have 50,000 people. I sort of envision it as kind of a place where I grew up. You had there's a population of about 50,000. It was surrounded by farmland, largely agrarian, with people who own businesses in the center of town. So it had a downtown, which was modern and paved and everything. But, you drive 2 minutes past the last stoplight in town and you're in cornfields. That's how I envisioned this particular township where Lu Fei lives.
And, he's a comp. And he has been downsized, as you say, from Harbin for various reasons. And he's bucking up against not only, corruption in the policing system, but he's also bucking up against the party. And, as always seems to be true, anybody with any kind of political power seems to gravitate towards corruption. We're seeing it every day right here. You just had to read about Joe Manchin today in West Virginia, the New York Times. They go, oh my God, there it is.
Yeah.
It seems like nobody goes into politics as a civic duty anymore. I mean, I think back to our founding fathers. I think back to George Washington, who, he served his term and then he refused a monarchy. He served his term, or maybe it was 2, I can't quite remember. And then he went home. And Harry Truman, who famously said, when he went back home to Missouri, that, they said, what did you do? And he said, I took the suitcases up to the attic.
Right.
That kind of, the first direct challenge we have had to a peaceful handover of power, regardless of whether an election or two has been rigged, and clearly there's more than one that has been, is Donald Trump. He's the first one that, has actually attempted to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power to the next office holder. And, it's been a horrible time, I think, for our country. And we still don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But there is that's a different thing. That's what's going on in Harbin and all over China. There doesn't seem to be a lot of opportunity for a peaceful transfer of power.
Well, it's interesting, if you're writing a crime novel, you're talking about bad people doing bad things. That's just the nature of a crime novel.
And conflict, lots of
And
conflict.
conflict, right.
Yeah.
So, you're stirring the pot. Of course, I could write a love story set in China and it could be all about wonderful things, but I am looking for conflict.
Right.
I'm looking for turmoil. So the problem is that you don't want to come across as criticizing unfairly. Those of us who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. So when I talk about corruption in China, I'm not saying China is the only place that has a corrupt government. Every government is corrupt to some extent. I live in New York. Albany's always coming out with stories of influence peddling and bribery and things like that. So China definitely doesn't have a monopoly. But, this is actually kind of an interesting thing that's specific to China. When Xi Jinping came to power, one of the ways that he consolidated his power is by launching an anti-corruption campaign. At the time, I think a lot of party officials felt like or understood that the party was corrupt, that politicians were corrupt. So it was expedient for Xi Jinping to say, I'm going to wipe out he called them tigers and flies, tigers being the high level ones, flies being the local small fry bureaucrats. He launched this campaign. It's netted, I read a statistic that said it's netted 1 million officials, if you can imagine such a thing, 1 million, for bribery and influence, peddling and so on. But if we're cynical, we could also say that allowed Xi Jinping to sort of purge a lot of people that he felt might be his rivals.
Right.
So yes, he launched this anti-corruption campaign. He's netted a lot of big fish and a lot of minnows, and in the process has basically eliminated anybody who can contest his absolute power. So in that sense, that is a unique aspect of what's going on in China and how the corruption is leading to the current political situation.
Is that a little bit like Stalin's purges, do you think?
I did not study Russian history. I believe Stalin just basically shot people. I'm not sure.
Well, but the idea was the same. He didn't want, any rivals to power. And I think if you look back, I've already mentioned the Ottoman Empire, it would be true that when one heir finally made it to the throne, very often they ended up strangling all their, half siblings. And to prevent that, I don't remember, maybe the Manchu did the same thing. But, it was very dangerous to be, you can look at Tudor England and see, a similar thing. If you, in any kind of power-centric hereditary structure, which she is now basically created because, he's made himself like, ruler for life.
Yeah.
There's a constant danger for anybody who becomes just that little bit too powerful and therefore presents sort of a challenge. And it gets worse as the person at the center ages.
Yeah.
We can see it with Putin, it's really terrifying to watch that. And you could see it with Trump. It's exactly the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. She's an interesting case. His basic history is that he was a little princeling. His father was a confidant of Mao, was a, dark red revolutionary during that whole period, a loyal ally to Mao. And so she had something of a privileged upbringing, as those people did. Then when Mao sort of started to get paranoid, he purged Xi's father. And Xi, at that point, I'm not sure how old he was, pretty young, was sent down to the countryside with all the other youth. And he ended up in Shanxi province or somewhere working on a farm for years, as most of those kids did and as the Red Guards did. And then he came back and he slowly worked his way into the government. Took him like several attempts to join the Communist Party. They don't accept everybody. And he worked his way up through small provincial posts and then into national posts. And he was able to portray himself as both a princeling or a elite and a man of the people because of these two sides of his experience. And some say that the reason why he was able to rise so quickly is that he was a great compromise candidate, because at that time you had two factions in China. You had the Shanghai Gang, those were the cultural elites, the coastal elites. You had the Chinese Communist Youth League, those were the inland people who were considered less sophisticated in some ways. And she straddled these two factions and therefore was considered a good compromise candidate for promotion. And so, that was his upward trajectory. Now he's managed to create the Xi Gang. There's no more Shanghai Gang or China Communist Youth League Gang. There's just the Xi Gang. The other thing is that, I avoided talking about Xi or naming Xi by name in the first two books, because if you want to get banned in China, mention Xi Jinping's name, especially in any kind of critical context. But in this book, because I'm talking about local corruption and the political system in China, is that the local political system is kind of a mirror of the national political system, and almost, except for a very low level, all local politicians or bureaucrats are appointed by the people above them. You kind of have to talk about national politics as well, in order to talk about local politics. So now
right. And local politics are, a big part of Lu Fei's existence, and also the Lu Fei novels, because the investigations always have to navigate in part around local politics and, people above him who don't want him to pursue, he's a real iconoclast in lots of ways, which of course makes him interesting. You've also given him a kind of unusual romance, which started in The Thief of Souls, but has progressed very slowly. And she's a great character too. So, where'd she come from? How did you envision her?
I don't know what her original origin was, but I wanted to have a love interest who was independent, who wasn't just, arm candy for Lu Fei. And so for, the first two books, she really kind of resists his advances, not because she doesn't like, her name is Yan Yan, Luo Yan Yan, not because she doesn't like him, but because she's a widow, which I also thought was kind of an interesting turn. A single desirable male with high social status and a good salary, but he falls in love with a woman who's, a widow and owns a bar. So the Chinese have a phrase about, the lintel of your doors should be equal when you make a wedding match. And so in this case, maybe not so much, but that's okay. And she's an independent person who actually really loved her first husband. And when he died, she was she's still grieving. So although Lu shows up and he's presentable and handsome and all these sorts of things, she hasn't gotten over her first husband, and she won't let him in for most of the series. So the first two books are really him pursuing her. Some readers thought he was too aggressive, which I thought was an interesting comment. I just thought he was just a guy who wore his heart on his sleeve. He wasn't trying to pressure her to anything. He just loved her, And then by the third book, their relationship has finally, they've become a couple. So.
Right. Well, she travels with him in the second book. She travels with him to a seaside town, if I remember right.
Yeah.
And so they don't travel in, necessarily intimate sense, but at least she is willing to, leave her bar for a little while. And in fact, they become acquainted because Lu Fei, living in this small town, needs a place to eat. It's not like he's particularly gifted cook or anything. So it starts, in a fairly. There's a wonderful Italian series called The Bastards of Pizza Falcone, which I adore, and which I'm hoping will have one more season. But again, there's a kind, a thing about, cops don't have a lot of time to spend on domestic pursuits or interests and so forth. And so they tend to meet people who maybe feed them or
Right.
run a bar or whatever it might be,
Yeah.
because that sort of makes sense. So anyway, Liu Fei makes a foray a lot of the time into Harbin or
Yeah.
other places, because his village or his township is really too small for the entire stories that you want to tell. It would be an awful lot like a Cabot's Cove kind of a environment. So what's going on in this case? It's called the Magistrate for a reason. So why don't you give us like your wonderful story pitch?
So there's basically two intertwined story threads here, and the first one is set in Harbin, and it is about this group of crooked politicians who have like a secret society. They are all politicians in one particular district of the city, all high-level officials, and they kind of milk that district and their positions for all kinds of ill-gotten gains. But they keep to themselves, they keep their association secretive. And I explain in the book how this is possible in a place like China because of the way that the politics and business are structured. But there's a vigilante out who calls himself or herself or themselves the magistrate. The magistrate is an imperial term. Back in the old days, when you had an emperor, the magistrate was the person who was basically the highest official in a local jurisdiction. The magistrate's job, and the magistrate was sent, in those days you had a national examination. You took the examination, depending on how you did, you got imperial ranking. And so they were dispatched to the local populace, and they were the tax collector, they were the military leader, they were the judge, jury, and executioner. So they would listen to court cases, they would decide what the penalty is, and then they would mete out the penalty as well. So this magistrate is hearkening back to this imperial time, and they are snatching these politicians off the street and administering certain kinds of punishments to them according to what the magistrate considers their crime to be. So obviously these politicians are freaked out. They're not only worried about their safety, but they're also worried about what this magistrate entity knows about them. So that's the one story thread. They're trying to figure out who that person is and catch them before they're outed or all killed. The second story thread is that Liu Fei, 30 or 40 miles away in Raven Valley, is called to the scene of a murder and discovers a body that's been burned and mutilated. And his investigation discovers that this is a gangster who runs a cyber sex operation in Harbin. So now, of course, Liu is drawn back to Harbin to investigate this case. And Harbin is the place where he got his start as a police officer and ran afoul of his supervisor and was exiled to Raven Valley. So it's a place that's very fraught with meaning and memories for him. When he gets to Harbin, he soon finds himself trapped between the magistrate and these politicians and his old supervisor, who's now the chief of homicide and part of this cabal of corrupt politicians. So now Liu is entangled in this web of vice and corruption and trying to figure out all these, who everybody is and how to solve this case.
Right. It's an excellent plot. And, years ago, there was an author called Elliot Pattison who won an Edgar for a really, truly brilliant book called Skull Mantra. And again, the thesis is that there's a Chinese official. I don't think he's an actual policeman. I can't remember. But anyway, some kind of official member of the party who falls afoul of somebody who exiles him. And he is in a terrible prison, sort of a version of Lubyanka prison in Russia or whatever it is, out on the borders of Tibet. And it's a truly brilliant novel. And there are several more in that series. I'm also a great fan of the mysteries of Xu Shilong, who has written. He won, I'm trying to remember, an Anthony Award, I think, for his first novel, The Death of a Red Heroine. And he's gone on to chronicle in Shanghai with a detective who's a poet, a well-respected poet, which has saved him being a well-respected poet a couple of times from
Right.
disaster where he is. And, I know Chu well. He's been to the store many times, and he's actually lived away from China for a long time. But he too talks about, and I think, I can't remember if it's in Death of a Red Heroine or which one of the early books, that each like block or neighborhood in Shanghai had a basically a neighborhood Nazi is what it was. And this person, like the drone thing that you're talking about before drones, this person, kept an eye on everybody within whatever their purview was and reported them. So it was a surveillance society in that, whichever book it was, in one of the very early ones, without technology, but on a human level. And I'm sure that technology has now allowed a surveillance society to become even more effective. And then, of course, I've already mentioned Judge Dee. And of course, Judge Dee was a magistrate in a society very similar to what Brian's been talking about. If you read them, you are aware of what the duties were of. And, there was a very complicated exam system for getting into the civil service, so to speak, the bureaucracy. You weren't necessarily born to it. In fact, you weren't. I think everybody had to pass some kind of, basically like a law school, like the LSATs or the SATs.
There were local exams, provincial exams, national exams. Yeah.
Right. So they did have, a bureaucracy that did allow for a certain amount of, meritocracy is not the right word. It did allow for people who had some excellency to rise above whatever their, origins were.
Those exams have been written about a lot. They're very interesting. You're right. They did give the illusion of social mobility. And for some people, like, you could be a poor kid, but if you were able to get education, which wasn't a given, you could rise. But those exams, which were really the only measure apart from connections to appoint political officials, were the equivalent of a very liberal arts degree in a small liberal arts college. There was poetry, there was essay writing, there was nothing about science, management, technology. Well, I mean, we're talking about the 14, 15, 16.
We're in the Tang Dynasty, which is like 800 AD.
Right. But even so, there was no political theory to speak of. I'm not even sure there was history necessarily. So these people who spent their entire lives studying for these exams, and then they would pass and they would be appointed, were totally unprepared for the pressures of actually running any kind of bureaucracy. It's part of the problem.
That's absolutely true. It reminds me somewhat of the whole Oxford Cambridge system, which operated forever on kind of an amateur system in the sciences and all kinds of things. But anyway, I do think that by putting him in Harbin, he's even though the party has control and all the rest of it, they're a little bit removed. It still is more rural than Shanghai or Beijing. Or why hasn't anybody ever set a series in Xi'an? Tell me that, because I think Xi'an is absolutely fascinating.
It is. I went there in '87 and saw the terracotta warriors.
Right.
This was early days, before China had opened up, and there wasn't much there. I don't know what's there now. I'm sure it's much more built up, but literally it was like being in the Gobi Desert with some buildings and then this burial mound. So, I think it's fascinating also.
It's the gateway to the Silk World. When you go there, which I did in 1997, there's a synagogue, there's the mosque, there are, the ghost gates, it was a blend of all kinds of different cultures because of the Silk Road. And I think it's an absolutely, if there's still a lot of the ruins there, the city walls are still there, the 26, of course, Dumpling Banquet House is still there. You got to be careful, because if you don't pace yourself, it's disastrous. And the whole story behind the terracotta warriors and basically the first Jew emperor who you do know about him, that whole story.
Sure.
I mean, I think the fact that, this is an emperor who died, and because there was no succession plan, they put him on ice in his chariot and drove him around until they could figure it out, hoping he wouldn't completely disintegrate physically while they tried to work it out. I mean, it's an unbelievably great story. And as I understand it, the tomb, his tomb has not yet fully been, or maybe never really fully penetrated.
Well, there's a lot of stories about that. So the tomb is a mini city with quicksilver
Right.
rivers and, riches beyond imagining. But the theory is that it was robbed a long time ago and there's nothing in there. But the Chinese authorities know a good story when they hear one. So the
Mercury may still be there, if the Mercury was the line of defense.
The technology is now such that they should be able to explore it. And so we don't really know what they're doing. The Chinese archaeologists, they have very good Chinese archaeologists, but they're a little bit closed-mouthed because, like many countries, the archaeological discovery should support the national, the story that the authorities want to tell about the nation. So I think
if you support the origin story or the mythology.
So if they find something, they have to clear it through several channels before it can be publicly announced.
I can believe that the tomb was robbed, but I do think there's a chance that the Lake of Mercury, which was sort of the defense, might still be there. Who knows?
Oh yeah.
But anyway, yeah, no, it's and if they ever do find which Khan is it? It was tomb. Is it Genghis?
Kublai Khan.
Kublai Khan. If they ever find
Genghis Khan. They
know it's Genghis. I'm pretty sure that it may never be found, or it may have been looted and destroyed, and that's why nobody can find it. Who knows? But then we don't know where Alexander is buried. We have no idea whether Cleopatra had a tomb or whether she was thrown into the Nile or whatever. So there's all this great stuff. Anyway, let's go back to Harbin and the magistrate. So the case that Liu Fei has to investigate is, who's picking off these people. And then I guess another question is, does he really want to? Because maybe they're doing a public service.
Right. So essentially what happens is the mayor of that district is murdered, and the people outside of this corrupt group of politicians call in our old friends at the Central Investigations Bureau in Beijing. So Dr. Ma, who is the forensic specialist, female forensic specialist who appeared in the first book, arrives and forms a task force. And she suspects that the police department, the homicide department run by Xu, Lu's old boss, who fired him and exiled him, isn't being forthcoming. So she invites Lu to join the task force, which of course upsets Xu very much and delights Lu because he's always looking for an opportunity to, resolve this unfinished business he has with his ex-boss. So Lu joins this task force, and he knows that the authority, that Xu and the other people are not being forthcoming with their information, and so he's trying to dig below the surface. He doesn't even really know the magistrate exists at that point, but he digs below the surface. He finds out there's a connection between these different politicians who have been targeted, and so on and so forth. So it's actually quite, I think it was Kirkus called it a complex crime yard. It's quite complex. There's a lot going on, a lot of different threads happening.
There are. No, the action is extraordinary and, pretty unsparing, I might add. This is not a cozy.
No, not right cozy.
I find it fascinating. Brian, what has drawn you to writing about contemporary China? I mean, it's not that easy to do that from, you're living in New York. You've written some of this during COVID when you couldn't, even if you've been able to travel to China, you couldn't.
Yeah. Well, I studied Chinese cultural anthropology in school, and I lived in Taiwan for a few years, and I traveled around Asia quite a bit. And but I've spent my career in publishing outside. I did work for a Chinese publishing company in Taiwan for 3 years, but after that, I've spent my career in publishing different things, microfilms, martial arts books, children's educational books. So I've made my living in publishing. And I decided, hey, why not leverage all those years of experience into something fictional? I had, been writing for a while. I wrote my first book got published. It was called Kill Devil Falls, which was basically a very dark noir book that was set in basically close to where I grew up in the San Joaquin Valley, in the mountains in the San Joaquin Valley. That came out, went out of print 6 months later. I wrote several more books which didn't get picked up by publishers, and I started a series set in Vietnam, and I wanted to explore Vietnam from the Tet, just before the Tet Offensive up until the Americans left, which is kind of a very interesting period of time. You had the CIA, you had the Viet Cong, you had had local gangs, you had the National Vietnamese Army, you had the police. There was a lot of French influence. So I wanted to write about that, and in the process of researching, especially when it came to the language, I was at a disadvantage. So I decided, well, instead of writing about Vietnam, a place that I know and have been to many, many times, but I don't really speak the language, I can just write about China. My Chinese used to be better than it is now, but it's certainly enough to put things in the book and so on. So yeah, that's why I just write what you know, and I decided to leverage all of those years into something useful.
So now that you've, published 3 novels in the Lou Fei series and have the bit between your teeth, I'm going to assume that you're going to want to keep on writing.
Oh yeah, I mean, I like to keep on writing. I don't know if the Lou Fei series will continue, because the sad reality of publishing is that books have to sell in order for a publisher to continue printing them. The first 2 have sold only moderately. The third one's gotten a little bit more buzz. This one, the Magistrate, today's the publishing day, but already it's gotten a bit more buzz. And so we'll see where it goes. I'd love to continue the series, but if not, just write something else, just keep going. Keep on
Well,
going.
you have other ideas. I mean, writers generally don't retire from writing, with 1 or 2 exceptions that I could name, but
Right.
right. But
Yeah.
anyway, I've really enjoyed them. And for those of you who are interested in China, we've touched upon 4 different authors that I think, are worth reading. I'm going to go back to Robert van Gulik, who was a Dutch diplomat stationed in China and wrote the Judge D series. He was a poet himself. And they give you a really excellent background. Chu Shalong, I like his books a lot. I think the poetry part is really fascinating. The idea of they're a police series, We have Brian's books, and then was one other. Who did I fail to mention?
The Skull Mantra.
Oh, yeah, Elliot Pattison, right. Yeah. Skull Mantra, I think, is great. And then in June, at the end of June, Lisa C. is going to come to the store, and she has written stories about historical China and also a Chinese-American nexus, her own. I'm trying to remember if it's her grandfather or great-grandfather. Anyway, she wrote about that in a book called On Gold Mountain. And so she's, her huge success was a book called Snowflower and the Secret Fan. But she writes about women and women's history, and Chinese women. And, for a society that's not that familiar to many people outside of China, these are kind of different windows that you can open up and, learn things. And I think part of the joy of being a mystery reader and probably being a mystery writer is that opportunity, to have a great story that also gives you some instruction and has a certain magic carpet quality, because I'm probably never going to go to Harbin, but I do feel like, through Brian's books that I've been there and have some familiarity with it. So, that's the magic of books, right? That you get to go places and experience things.
That was really my goal in writing the series is, growing up, like you said, I gravitated towards books which were interesting and entertaining, but also taught me something. It could be a historical fiction, or it could even be contemporary. Even if you're reading a crime novel and a book's describing how to pick a lock, for example, those are the details, the real details that I crave as a reader, and that I try to inject in these books. So while I'm telling a fictional story, I'm trying to craft a plot that could only occur in the setting that I have, which is China. The first book dealt with marriage, customs, death, superstition, as well as low-level corruption or the political system. And the second book was about illegal animal trafficking. This book is about corruption, but it's also about this unfortunate situation you have of women and girls who defect from North Korea and pay brokers to spirit them into China, expecting to get a high-paying job in a factory and maybe meet a nice person and get married. And they're sold into brothels or sold as brides. And their situation is really untenable because as China and North Korea are allies of a sort, if they go to the Chinese authorities, they'll just be repatriated back to North Korea and sent to prison camps, essentially, as criminals. They're really, damned if they do and damned if they don't. But anyway, the idea is that these plots are always informed by the setting, and you couldn't take the plot of any of these books and put it anywhere else. They couldn't be in Copenhagen, they couldn't be in Nebraska. This is where they belong. So that's been my goal in writing this series as well.
Well, I think you've done brilliantly with it. And it reminds me that indeed the human trafficking of the women from North Korea, I think, has also been spurred on by the one-child policy. There aren't enough women. There are not enough women of childbearing age, in China. So it's one reason India has now surpassed them. And not that I think that's a necessary goal, because, there's all kinds of problems with having a huge population. But I did think that you did a great job with it. Let's call Patrick up and see if there are any questions or comments that he has, Brian.
Okay.
There we go. All right, let's see here. Let me check. Let's see. Yeah, no real comments that have come in. I was thinking, Barbara, of who was that other author that wrote a few books? Elsa Hart.
Well, there's a British author too, whose name totally escapes me at the moment, that wrote several books set in China, but I think it was more a sort of British China thing. And there certainly were some books set in Hong Kong. And then there was a woman whose books I truly loved that wrote a brilliant book. She was she was interested in cultural things. And her first book was about Peking Man in the Gobi Desert. And the third one had to do with the treasures of the Imperial Palace being spirited away to Taiwan. So I'm going blank on her name, but I love those books.
It's not Elsa Hart?
No, I can't think of her name. I own them, but I'm not in my library, so I can't go look them up. But
gotcha.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of, just as a kind of aside, there's a lot of interest now in film and television about Asia-themed stories, basically because of Everything, Everywhere, All at Once, won all the Oscars.
Yeah, but Korean is also, my absolute all-time favorite TV series of the last year is Extraordinary Attorney Woo, which is beyond brilliant. And I didn't realize that South Korea had become this kind of, film mecca. And not only are the stories great and the acting great, but there is a computer-generated world of whales and dolphins that inform the story. And oh man, it is just brilliant.
Yeah, they have a very well-developed film and television industry in
You
South
bet.
Korea. But I basically took Thief of Souls and sort of started pitching it to television producers, and I've gotten some of the feedback I've gotten is, oh, we already have a Chinese serial killer story in production. So
Oh,
there's a
really?
lot of stuff coming down the pipe in this particular genre, I think.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's a hot topic, and we'll see. We'll see what happens. I think Americans are curious about China, but not that curious. I think they're reading a lot of propaganda about Chinese spy balloons and stealing of American technology, and those things are true. And on the other side, the Chinese populace is fed a steady diet of America's the evil empire, disrespects the Chinese people, and tries to keep China down geopolitically. The last part is true, not the other parts, perhaps. So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings on both sides. There are valid grievances on both sides, but the propaganda is just kind of like overwhelming. And my daughter had an interesting comment when I told her the first two books haven't sold as well as I had hoped. She said, "Well, I think you're straddling a couple of demographics. People who want to read thrillers and spy novels and mysteries, and this of course doesn't hold true for you guys or a lot of people, but they don't necessarily want to read about a Chinese protagonist because the propaganda, it would be like right now buying a book about a Russian police officer with everything that's going on in Ukraine. It's just now's maybe not the time. But people who are really interested in Asia are not that interested in a person who's not of Asian ancestry writing the book. So, I think I'm caught in between a couple of demographics here, but that's just the zeitgeist. We'll see what happens.
Well, you're right. May is Asian Heritage Month, and there's a huge play all of a sudden, for books. I've been inundated with them the last couple of days. Books set in all manner of Asian countries, whether it's Korea or China or Japan or, Vietnam or India or whatever it is. There's even a Malaysian series, the name of which I've forgotten. Isn't it the Anti-You, Patrick? Do you remember? I think there's a series, a kind of a cozy series about, I think it's YU, but I think it's Malaysian. So, right now there's an interest in that, but, I think you're right that the Cold War is, right at the moment is the war with Russia is heated up, but the Cold War is between, the US and China at the moment. But, I remember at the end of last century, people talked all the time about the 21st century was really going to be China's, coming into its own, that imperial regimes, so to speak, or I'm trying to remember what the word I want is, anyway, tend to last about a century. And, then Rome lasted longer than most, but, the 19th century was the British and the 18th was French and the 20th was American. And, we'll move on towards China. Kind of the way things evolve. Societies that do well and become rich and powerful tend to get complacent and fond of luxury and no longer able to summon up the kind of will that made them who they were. It's just the story of history. China also has a difficult colonial history because it was viciously exploited by European powers.
Yeah, they haven't forgotten either.
Yeah. So I think that's part of it too. And one of the reasons I think it was easy for Mao to do what he did. So yeah. I know, and I've had a long life, and I wish I could live a lot longer just to see how all these forces play out, but I probably won't. But anyway, it's fascinating to kind of speculate. Anything from you, Patrick, beyond all this?
No, I don't think so. It's been a fascinating conversation.
Well, I really like talking to Brand, and I'm sure you're going to do well, whatever it is. So be sure you keep me posted. So
I will. Thank you so much.
Great. So let me remind you again that The Magistrate, which is a terrific book, we have autographed copies of it, and you can get a paperback of The Thief of Souls, which is the first book
Yep.
in the Lou Fei series, and Wild Prey will be coming into paperback sometime down the road here. So if it ends up being a trilogy, it's a great trilogy. And if it goes on, then we'll see what Brian does next. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. It's really been a pleasure. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Good night, Brian. Thank you.